I found the anomaly on day 41 of our return transit, which meant it had been there for 68 days before I noticed it. That is not a comfortable thing to admit. I have been a systems integration engineer for 19 years, and I take some pride in knowing what my instruments are doing at any given moment. TFSN Ardent was a Wedge-class survey destroyer, not a young ship, not a glamorous assignment, and the integration console in her engineering core was as familiar to me as the back of my own hand. Every vibration in the hull had a cause I could name. Every spike in the passive sensor array had a source I could trace. I had spent 2 full years aboard before this transit, and I knew the ship's electromagnetic baseline the way a doctor knows a patient's resting pulse. The Ardent was built lean and hard. Wedge profile was designed for deep survey work. Good sensor coverage, reduced cross-section in the axis most likely to face a threat, enough engine mass to push her out of trouble at short notice. She was not built for comfort, and she did not provide it. The engineering core was a long, narrow space, 2 decks below the keel, running parallel to the main power conduit, slit in the red-shifted working spectrum that kept your eyes adjusted for instrument work. 3 integration consoles, a secondary diagnostic bay, a parts locker big enough to have killed a man if it had ever fallen on one. The ship had been running for 22 years, and she smelled like it. Hot metal and lubricant, and the faint chemical trace of the recycled air that had been breathed by 3 crews before mine. I had learned to find that smell reassuring. The anomaly did not announce itself. That was the first thing I should have understood, and didn't. What I found on day 41 was a carrier wave. Very low amplitude, spread across a frequency range just below the threshold our automated filters were configured to flag. It had been there. I confirmed this later, pulling logs, since day -27, which meant it predated our departure from the survey station by nearly 4 weeks. It had traveled with us out of the Candrith system and across the empty Kent corridor, between there and known space. It was present in every passive sensor record the Ardent had generated across a total of 109 days. Ported it up the chain as an equipment artifact. Frequency drift in the passive array, I said. Possibly a calibration issue introduced when we repaired the port sensor cluster, after the micro-debris strike in week 3 of the outbound leg. I filed the report, flagged it for review at the next scheduled maintenance window, and went back to my work. That was my first mistake. My second was not being curious enough about why the artifact showed the same amplitude and the same internal structure every single day, regardless of our position, our speed, or the electromagnetic environment around us. Equipment artifacts drift. They change with temperature cycling, with radiation exposure, with the mechanical stress of maneuvering burns. This one did not change at all. It was as regular as a heartbeat, as consistent as a calibration signal from a known source. And I had filed it under probably nothing because I was tired, and because the Ardent was a survey destroyer on a routine return transit fee, and because probably nothing is what you tell yourself when you are 41 days into a 60-day run home and you have used up all of your professional alarm on real problems. I want to be fair to myself here because it would be easy to look back and make that filing feel stupider than it was. The Ardent was returning from an 8-month survey run in the Candrith system, had produced a lot of data, and 2 significant equipment failures and 1 crew medical emergency, and the micro-debris strike that had occupied my engineering team for a full week of repair work. I was tired, the whole ship was tired. We were a survey crew at the back end of a long deployment, and the corridor we were crossing was known space, not deep space, not a frontier transit. A route the fleet had been running for 11 years without incident. The passive sensor array was old equipment. Calibration drift was a known issue on that array. I had a reason for every part of the conclusion I reached, and the reasons were not bad reasons. They were just wrong. It is not a comfortable thing to admit. I am admitting it anyway, because the rest of this account depends on understanding that the anomaly was not dramatic. It was not a blinking alarm, or an obviously structured signal, or something any competent engineer with fresh eyes would have spotted immediately. It was a very quiet thing living below the level of our automated detection, and I walked past it for 68 days because I was looking for larger things, and this was not large. I am telling you this because I want you to understand that when the truth finally surfaced, it was not because of any brilliant piece of detective work on my part. It was because Lieutenant Commander Esif Prahl had insomnia. Prahl was the Ardent signals officer, and she was not a woman who tolerated mysteries. She was compact and precise and relentlessly methodical, and she had a habit of working through the night cycle on problems that had no immediate operational urgency, simply because she could not sleep when there was something she did not understand. She had picked up my equipment artifact report 2 weeks after I filed it, because she was assigned to it, but because she ran a nightly scan of all open technical flags as a form of mental discipline. She had started pulling logs. She came to the engineering core at 0340 ship time on day 57, when I was alone at the integration console, running a scheduled diagnostic on the secondary coolant sensors. She did not knock. She pulled up a chair, set her tablet on the console beside mine and said, "Your artifact has a grammar." I looked at her. "The carrier wave," she said. "It has an internal structure. I have been parsing it for 11 days, and I think it has a grammar. Not a code, not a signal in the conventional sense. Something more like a frame, a container. Something designed to carry other information without the carrier itself being noticed." I told her I had filed it as equipment drift. "I know," she said. "You were wrong." She showed me the logs. She had pulled every passive sensor record the Ardent had generated since departure from the survey station, and she had run the carrier wave against every known source of natural electromagnetic phenomena in the region: stellar wind fluctuations, gravitational lensing effects, background radiation from the Candrath system's binary pair, trace emissions from 3 known dead relay stations in the transit corridor. The wave matched none of them. Its amplitude was too consistent, internal structure too organized. Natural phenomena are fractal. They repeat with variation. This wave repeated without variation. 11 days of close analysis and Prahl had found zero drift in its fundamental signature. "It is not our equipment," she said, "and it is not natural. So what is it?" I did not have an answer. "Neither do I," she said. "Yet, but I want you to look at something." Psh! She pulled up a particular section of the wave's internal structure, the thing she had been calling its grammar. It was not immediately legible as a signal. It looked, if anything, like structured silence, regular gaps in the carrier, nested at intervals too precise to be coincidental, too complex to be a simple on-off pattern. She had mapped those gaps against the Ardent's own outbound signals over the same period. Our active sensor pings, our engine emission profiles, standard comm traffic, and she had found correlations. The gaps in the carrier wave corresponded to specific moments in the Ardent's own signal output. Not randomly, not approximately, precisely. The wave's internal structure was a record of everything the ship had been broadcasting outward, reduced to a compressed annotation, embedded in the carrier, and then, as far as Prahl could determine, transmitted somewhere else. "It is a relay," she said quietly. "Someone has been using us as a relay, or more specifically, someone has been using us as a subject. Everything we have broadcast outward since we left Candrath has been captured, annotated, and sent somewhere. We are being observed." I sat with that for a long time. The word observed is not a large word. It does not have the weight it should in print. Sitting in the red-lit engineering core, at 034 with the secondary coolant diagnostic still cycling on the primary display, I let the full size of it all found that I could not manage it all at once. A piece came through clearly. We have been watched. The next piece was slower, for 109 days, then the next, slower still, and we did not know. "Observed," I said. "By what?" "I do not know yet," she said. "But I have been here, and they have been watching." She went back to her quarters after that, and I sat alone in the engineering core, with the integration console, running its diagnostics, and the full weight of what she had just told me settling into my chest like ballast. I am not a panicking man. 19 years in the fleet teaches you that the worst thing you can do in a crisis is move before you understand what you are dealing with. I sat there for 2 hours, and I did not touch the comm panel, and I did not log anything new, and I did not change the Ardent's operating profile by so much as a fractional adjustment to the passive sensor sensitivity. I thought about what it meant to have been watched for 109 days without knowing it. I thought about what had been visible: course, our speed, our sensor patterns, our communication habits, our maintenance schedules, our equipment faults, our crew rotations, our engine cycles. I thought about the micro debris strike in week 3 of the outbound leg, the week my team had been running open hull work on the sensor cluster, the week we had been sloppy and exhausted and making the kind of low-level errors that are invisible in a formal report but visible in the pattern of a crew under stress. All of that had been there in our outbound signal, in our timing, in the shape of what we did and how we did it. 109 days of a Terran Federation survey destroyer, going about her business in what believed to be empty space. The bitter part, and there is always a bitter part, was that we had not been doing anything wrong. The Ardent was a survey destroyer on a routine return transit. We had not been aggressive, had not been provocative, had not made any of the contact protocol errors that the fleet's doctrine warned about. We had simply existed in what turned out not to be empty space. And something had been watching us exist, and had been watching for far longer than we had been traveling. At 0600 I requested a command conference. Captain Aura Selen convened it in the wardroom at 0630 with Prahl, myself, the executive officer commander, Thad Vort, and the ship's tactical officer, Lieutenant Henra Das. I gave Prahl the floor, and she laid out everything she had found. She was calm and precise and did not editorialize. When she finished, the wardroom was quiet for a moment. Captain Selen was a tall woman with gray at her temples and a way of listening that made you feel. She had already considered every angle of what you were saying before you finished saying it. She had commanded the Ardent for 3 years. Before she had on 2 frigates and a heavy cruiser, and she had been through 2 contact events in her career. Neither of them clean, neither of them the way the Academy materials described. She was not easy to alarm. She was also not easy to fool, and she knew the difference between an unknown and a threat. She listened to Prahl. She asked 4 questions, all of them technical, all of them precisely the right questions. Then she sat back and looked at the table for a moment. "How long have they been watching?" she said. Prahl said she could confirm 109 days on the Ardent specifically. The carrier wave's internal annotation structure suggested it was not tuned to our ship in particular. It was tuned to our ship class and our emission profile, which meant it had probably been active across the entire transit corridor for longer than we had been in it. "How much longer?" Selen asked. "The annotation structure uses a compression format I have never seen before," Prahl said, "based on its complexity, based on how many layers it has, and how efficient each layer is. I think it has been in active use for a long time, possibly years, possibly considerably longer." "They have been watching us," Vort said. It was not a question. Not just us, the corridor. Everything that crosses the corridor. "Yes," Prahl said. "And we have been crossing the corridor how often?" Selen said. She was looking at me. I told her. The Candrith survey run was a standard route. The Ardent made it twice a year. Other survey destroyers, other fleet vessels, some civilian traffic. The corridor saw perhaps 40 transits per standard year. Had been doing so for 11 years since the Candrith system was opened for survey operations. 40 transits per year, 11 years, 440 opportunities to be watched. The wardroom was very quiet. Vort said, "What do we do? I want to be accurate about what happened next, because I have heard different versions of it in the years since, and some of them make the decision sound more deliberate than it was. The truth is that there was no obvious answer. Contact protocol, formal Terran Federation first contact doctrine, was explicit about accidental contact events. If you found evidence of observation without prior mutual acknowledgement, you were to maintain your current profile, do nothing to escalate or reveal that you had discovered the observation, and return to known space to report. Let the analysts and the diplomats handle it." That was the rule. It was a reasonable rule. It had been written by people who understood the risks of hasty action, and who had spent a great deal of time thinking about what happens when species meet before they are ready to meet. Selen read it from the doctrine tablet Das had pulled up. She read it twice. Then she set the tablet down and said, "They know we are here. They knew we were here before we knew they were here. They know our course, our speed, our operational habits, our communication patterns, our equipment maintenance cycles. And, in all likelihood, the same information about every ship that has crossed this corridor for 11 years. Maintaining our current profile does not conceal anything from them. We have nothing left to conceal. Nobody disagreed with that. We can go silent. Offered. Shut down all active missions, give them nothing new. We have been giving them something for 109 days, Selene said. Going silent now is itself information. It tells them we found the wave. It tells them we know we are being watched, and that our response to being watched is to hide. That is also information, and it is not accurate information. What is accurate information? Asked. Selene looked at Prahl. You built a transmission? Prahl said she could build a transmission on any frequency and format she had. Instruments for. She could also modulate the carrier wave itself, if the wave used a frequency range her transmitters could address, which, given that her receivers had been passively logging it for weeks, was likely. Not a hail, Selene said. Not a weapons test. Not a maneuver that could read as aggressive. I want to transmit. Everything, a pause. Everything. Everything the Ardent has, Selene said. Every log, every sensor record, every engine telemetry file, every crew manifest, every maintenance report, everything we have broadcast over the last 109 days, and everything we have generated internally that we have not broadcast. All of it. Raw. Uncrofensims. In the clearest format we can manage, Vort said. That is the opposite of contact protocol. Contact protocol, Selene said, assumed we would be discovering that we were being watched. We did not discover it. We were informed of it, by our own instruments, because we are competent. The situation is different. They have been studying us, and what they have been studying is a version of us that does not know it is being studied. A managed version. Whatever they think they know about us, they know it about a ship that was performing normally without awareness of observation. I want them to see a ship that knows it is being observed, chooses to remain exactly what it is. She looked around the table. We are not going to hide. We are not going to perform. We are going to be exactly what we are, and we are going to transmit it. There was a silence that lasted perhaps 10 seconds. Then Vort nodded. Das nodded. Prahl was already reaching for her tablet. I nodded too, though nobody was waiting for my nod. I was the engineer at the table, not the decision maker, but I want the record to show that I agreed. Not because I was certain it was right. I was not certain of anything at that point except that we were a long way from home, and the rules we had brought with us did not quite fit the situation we were in. I agreed, because Selene's reasoning was the only one that did not require us to pretend to be something we weren't, and pretending seemed, in that moment, like the most dangerous thing we could do. It took Prahl 14 hours to build the transmission package. She worked without sleeping, with 3 of my junior techs assisting her on the signal formatting side. The package was enormous. 109 days of raw telemetry from every sensor the Ardent carried, all of it time-stamped and cross-referenced. All of it exactly as generated, with nothing removed or smoothed or summarized. She added the ship's complete engineering logs going back to departure, the crew manifest, the mission brief, the survey records from the Kandrath system, the incident report from the micro-debris strike, the maintenance tickets, the watch rotation schedule, the mess hall consumption logs. She added the communications traffic, all of it, internal and external, coded and plain language. She added the passive sensor records including the 109 days of the carrier wave itself, annotated with her own analysis and conclusions. She formatted it in 7 parallel encoding schemes, 2 of which were standard Terran Federation protocols, and 5 of which were derived from the compression architecture she had identified in the carrier wave, because if whoever was on the other end of that wave had built the carrier, they could read their own encoding. I spent 4 of those 14 hours helping her format the engineering logs. There is a particular kind of honesty in an engineering log that no other document type achieves. The formal reports are written for review boards and commanding officers. They are accurate but curated, the information arranged to support a conclusion. The raw engineering log is not written for anyone. It is a timestamp and a reading and a notation, repeated 1,000 times a day, and it shows you exactly what was happening and exactly what the person writing it was thinking about when they wrote it. You can see the fatigue in the notation frequency. You can see the moments of uncertainty in the qualification language. You can see the micro-debris strike happening in real time across 3 days of increasingly terse entries as my team worked through the damage, assessment, the repair plan, the parts sourcing, the execution, and the verification. It was not a flattering record, it was an accurate one. When I finished formatting it and handed it back to Prahl, I had the strange feeling of having handed someone a key to a room I had not known existed. Everything I had done on the outbound leg, everything I had decided, and everything I had gotten wrong, and everything I had eventually gotten right, all of it was there, in the log, in a form that was legible to anyone with the patience to read it. She brought me the completed package at 22:50 that evening, and I ran a validation sweep. Everything was there. Everything was real. There was no selection, no editorial management, no effort to present a version of the Ardent that was better or worse or different than what the actually was. A ship, a crew, a mission, 109 days of existence. I told her it was clean. She took it to Selene at 2300. Selene reviewed the package index for 20 minutes, asked 2 questions, and authorized transmission. At 01 cent on day 111 of our return transit, the TFSN Ardent modulated the carrier wave and transmitted everything she was into the dark. Then we waited. I do not know what I expected. I had no framework for it. In my 19 years of service, I had never been part of a first contact event, and the 2 Selene had told us about the engagement at Karath Passage, the survey encounter near the outer buffer, were different enough from our situation that they offered no useful template. Those had been encounters between ships that knew they were encountering each other. We had been encountered without knowing it, and now we were encountering back, and whatever came next was going to be something the doctrine manual had not accounted for. Came next was 53 hours of silence. Not empty silence, the carrier wave continued. It was still there, still doing whatever it had been doing, though Prahl reported that its internal annotation structure had changed in ways she could not fully parse within the first 12 hours. Something in the wave's grammar had shifted. That was a response to our transmission, or simply a coincidence of timing. She could not determine. She kept watching it. The rest of us kept running the ship, because a ship still has to run regardless of whether something is watching it. And perhaps, especially then, slept badly. Not from fear exactly, the threat assessment remained low, and a wave that had been running quietly for 109 days was not the profile of a precursor to hostile action. I slept badly because the ship felt different. The same red-lit engineering core, the same smell, the same rumble from the main drive, and yet, something had changed about what it meant to be aboard her. We were no longer simply a ship in transit. We were a ship that had been the subject of a sustained unknown observation, and that had responded to the observation by choosing to be fully visible, and that was now waiting to find out what fully visible looked like from the other side. The crew knew something was happening. It'd not have failed to know. The signals division working round-the-clock shifts is not a thing you conceal on a ship with 200 people in it. Selene briefed the senior enlisted on day 112 in terms that were accurate but deliberately spare. Anomalous signal contact, investigating, precautionary protocol in effect, no threat assessment change. Heard later that the brief had been received without panic, without drama, with the particular quality of calm that comes from people who have been doing hard work for a long time, and who understand that the proper response to an unknown is to keep doing the work while someone figures out the unknown. The Ardent's crew was a good crew. They had not become a good crew because anyone was watching them. They had become a good crew because Selene ran a tight ship, and because the work demanded it, and because 2 years of shared deployments have a way of pressing people together into something more reliable than any of them would have been alone. They did their jobs in those 53 hours, the same way they had been doing their jobs for the previous 109 days and the previous 2 years, and I found, watching them do it, that I was grateful for the record we had sent. Whatever the Oravathi made of us, they were making it from the real thing. I ate regularly. I ran my diagnostics and logged my reports and answered questions from the junior techs. about why the signals division was working around the clock. I told them it was a calibration project. It wasn't a lie. Prahl was, in a sense, calibrating. We all were. On the morning of day 113, the wave changed. Prahl was at the integration console when it happened. She had taken to working shifts in engineering rather than signals, partly because my console gave her a cleaner look at the raw wave data, and partly because I think she wanted company. She was at the console, and I was running a secondary diagnostic on the port sensor cluster, when she said very quietly, "It's answering." I came to stand behind her and look at the display. The carrier wave had not disappeared. It had expanded. Its frequency range was the same. Its fundamental amplitude was the same, but the internal structure, the grammar she had spent weeks parsing, had reorganized itself into something substantially more complex, where before it had been annotation. A compressed record of our outbound signals embedded in the carrier and relayed elsewhere. It was now something else. It took Prahl 4 hours to characterize it with any confidence, and even then she said she was working with partial understanding. "It is a response," she said. "Not a translation, not a decryption key, formal hail in any protocol I recognize. It is a response, in the same format as what we sent. They have taken our package, and they have sent something back in the same structure. Everything we showed them, they have shown us something in return." "What have they shown us?" I asked. "I am going to need time," she said. It took 5 days. 5 days of Prahl working in shifts with 2 of her signals officers, pulling apart the response package piece by piece, mapping its structure against the encoding schemes she had derived from the carrier waves, original grammar. In those 5 days we continued our transit home. We had not changed course, not increased speed, not altered the Ardent's operating profile in any way. Selene had made that decision immediately. Whatever was happening, the Ardent would continue to behave like exactly what it was, which was a survey destroyer on a scheduled return transit. The Ardent was also, as of day 113, being observed openly rather than covertly. The carrier wave was no longer subtle. Its amplitude had risen to the point where even our automated filters would have flagged it, had we not already disabled the filtering on that frequency range. It was not a threat signal, not a weapons lock, not an active sensor probe of the kind that gets logged under hostile contact indicators. It was simply present, and it was no longer pretending not to be. Whatever had been doing the watching had stopped pretending too. On day 118, Prahl brought me the first coherent fragment of the response package. We were in the wardroom, herself, Selene, Vort, Das, and me, and she pulled it up on the main display without preamble. What I saw looked, at first pass, like a star map. It wasn't. It was a survey record, but not one from any Terran Federation database I recognized. It covered a region of space that included the Kandrath corridor and the transit route the Ardent had been crossing. The perspective was wrong, too wide, the reference points too distant, the scale orders of magnitude larger than any chart I had worked with. "This is their range," Prahl said. "As best I can interpret it, this is the space they move in, or at least, the space they cover." The chart showed 47 marked locations. Some of them had notation clusters around them, dense with compressed information. Others were single points, bare. The Kandrath corridor was marked. The Ardent's outbound course and return course were marked. Our tracks, corded from the outside, laid onto their chart with the precision of an observer who had been watching carefully. 47 systems, Vort said. 47 observation posts, Prahl said. At minimum. I cannot determine from this how many of them are active and how many are historical, but the notation density suggests most of them are active. 47 systems, the corridor we had been crossing as a matter of routine, 11 times per year per ship, was one of 47. Selene looked at the chart for a long time. "Are any of them in known space?" Das asked. Prahl's expression answered before she did. "3, she said. "The notation on those 3 is different from the others. Denser, more layered. They have been active longer. 3 observation posts in known space. 3 positions from which something had been watching human traffic, not just in this one corridor, but in systems we had been using for years." The silence in the wardroom after that was a different kind of silence from the one after Prahl's first briefing. That first silence, had been the silence of people absorbing a surprise. This one was the silence of people absorbing the scale of what the surprise had actually been. "Who are they?" Selene asked. "That," Prahl said, "is the part I have spent the most time on. And I think I understand it well enough to say something, though not well enough to say I am certain." She pulled up the second fragment. It was not a map. It was, I am reaching for the right word. And I find I keep coming back to the same one, a record, a historical record. Structured chronologically, spanning what the notation suggested was an enormous span of time. Though parsing the timescale had been part of the interpretive challenge, Bird documented contact events. Not military contacts, not trade contacts, not diplomatic exchanges, observation events. Moments at which the entity that had been watching us had first begun watching a new species. The record listed 41 species. Each entry showed the same basic structure. A first observation date, a set of parameters that Prahl believed described the species' initial electromagnetic profile, the signal they were putting out when they were first detected, and then a long series of observation entries covering what looked like decades or centuries of subsequent watching. None of the 41 entries showed anything that looked like direct contact. No hails sent, no responses, no acknowledgement that the watching was happening from either side. 41 species detected and observed across what Prahl estimated was 6,000 years of sustained operation, and not one of them had ever been spoken to. "They have never made contact," Selene said. "Not direct contact," Prahl said. "Know what they do, what they have done. As long as this record goes back, is watch, observe, and then adjust." That was the word that had taken her the longest to arrive at, adjust. The record was not just an observation log. It was a management log. The adjustments were subtle. Prahl could not fully decode their technical specifics, but their structural pattern was clear enough. When a species being observed began moving in a direction, the Auravathi, that was the name, that appeared repeatedly in the record's notation headers, the name they used for themselves. Found concerning, the observation posts introduced modifications to the electromagnetic environment around that species' active systems, very slight modifications, below the threshold of detection. The kind of modifications that would not be noticed by the species in question, but that would, over time, over decades, shape the signals that species was putting out, shape what they were broadcasting, nudge them, gradually, away from whatever the Auravathi had decided was dangerous. 41 species, 6,000 years, all of them watched, all of them shaped, none of them told. Prahl did not need to say the next part out loud. We were all looking at the chart with the Kandrath corridor marked on it, and the 3 observation posts in known space, and the notation clusters around them. 11 years of Terran Federation traffic in this corridor, 40 transits per year, 440 opportunities to be observed, and the carrier wave had been running for far longer than 11 years. She had said that in the first briefing, and she had not revised the estimate since. The Auravathi had been watching humanity for longer than we had been in the Kandrath corridor. How much longer, the record did not make clear, but the entry that Prahl believed corresponded to humanity was not at the end of the list. It was not even near the end. It was entry 23 of 41. It was old. Selene said, "What were they adjusting?" "I cannot read the technical specifics of the adjustments," Prahl said. "What I can read is the assessment that preceded them. For each adjustment entry, there is an assessment block. What the Auravathi observed, what they evaluated as the concern, what they determined to address. The entry I believe corresponds to us. The assessments go back, far back, and they are not hostile assessments. They are careful ones, clinical. They appear to have been genuinely trying to be helpful." She did not say it with contempt. She said it the way you state a fact that is also a wound. "They were trying to help us," Vort said. "It helps to Charles to come what they thought we should be," Prahl said. "Which is not the same thing. And they were doing it without asking us. Without telling us. Without any acknowledgement that we might have an opinion on the matter. The silence that followed that was the longest one yet. I want to be careful here, because this is where, in the versions of the story I have heard since, the account tends to simplify in ways that are not accurate. There is a version that makes the Auravathi into villains. Manipulative, predatory, using their ancient technology to quietly deform humanity into a more manageable shape. There is another version that makes them into tragic figures, well-intentioned, genuinely convinced that what they were doing was a form of stewardship, horrified when they finally realized it had been noticed. Both of those versions are cleaner than the truth. The truth, as far as I could read it from that wardroom conversation, and the 5 weeks that followed it, was more uncomfortable than either. The Oravathi had been doing what they did because they had always done it, and what they had always done had always worked. And worked for them meant that the species they were watching had not destroyed themselves or each other, and the Oravathi had taken credit for that without ever having to ask the species whether they had wanted the help. It was a system that had operated for 6,000 years without ever being challenged, because in 6,000 years and 41 species, not one of them had ever noticed. We had noticed. Selene stood up from the table after the long silence and walked to the wardroom window, showed the transit corridor and its stars, all of them exactly where they should be, none of them giving anything away. She stood there for a moment and then she said, without turning around, "We should answer them." "We already answered them," Vort said. "We sent the package." "We sent the package before we knew what we were answering," she said. "Now we know. We should answer again." Prahl asked what she wanted to say. "Tell them what we know," Selene said. "Everything we have just figured out. Don't perform it. Don't dress it up. Just send it, the same as we sent the first package. All of our analysis, all of Prahl's interpretation work, our conclusions, our questions. The whole record of what we have spent the last 5 days working out, what we know, what we don't know, what we want to know." She turned from the window. "If they have spent 6,000 years watching without being asked what they see, perhaps it will be useful for them to be asked." It took Prahl 2 days to build the second package. It was smaller than the first, not because we had less to say, but because what we were sending this time was more specific. The first package had been everything we were. The second package was everything we had understood. Prahl included all of her analysis of the response they had sent, her interpretive framework, uncertainties, and the places where her interpretation might be wrong. She included the questions we had discussed in the wardroom and out in the clearest language she could manage in 7 parallel encoding schemes. She included a chart, our own chart, annotated with what we had learned, showing the 3 observation posts in known space, with a note that said, simply, "We know these are there. We are not asking you to remove them. We are asking you to tell us what you have learned." The second transmission went out on day 125. The Oravathi took 11 days to respond. 11 days of the carrier wave running open, visible, not pretending to be anything other than what it was. We continued our transit. We would have made it back to known space before the response came, if Selene had not ordered a modest reduction in speed on day 102, which extended our transit enough to keep us in the corridor. "It was," she said, "the polite thing to do. You do not walk away from a conversation when the other party is still composing their reply." Prahl's face when the response came was something I have thought about many times since. She was at the integration console when the wave changed again, and I was at my secondary station, and she looked up from the display and across at me with an expression I had not seen on her before and cannot fully describe. It was not triumph, and it was not relief, and it was not simply surprise. It was the expression of someone who has spent a long time working on a problem that has finally revealed itself to be larger than they understood, and is looking at the full size of it for the first time. "They are very old," she said, "and I think they are frightened." She was right. It took 3 weeks to fully parse the second response package, and in those 3 weeks we completed our transit and entered known space and filed our report with Fleet Command and sat through 4 separate briefings with people who had titles and access levels that I do not have clearance to name, and through all of it Prahl was working on the response and I was working alongside her whenever I could get time. Response was an answer to our questions, but it was also, and this took time to understand, an explanation, not an apology, an explanation. The Oravathi did not apologize, as far as we could tell, because they were not certain they had done wrong, and they were honest enough not to claim certainty they did not have. What they offered instead was an account of why they had built the system they had built, and what they had believed it was for, and what they had observed in us, and what our response to their observation had made them understand about what they had been missing. They had begun watching 6,000 years ago because they had watched two civilizations destroy themselves in what they described as the first century of their own awareness. They had not been able to help. They had not yet had the technology or the reach. They had been young, and the two civilizations had been older and faster, and had consumed themselves before the Oravathi could reach across the distance. But they had remembered. The record included a section on those two losses that Prahl said was unlike the rest of the document in tone. Denser, recursive, structured less like an operational log, and more like something that had been written and rewritten many times over many years, by many different hands, or the equivalent of hands, each revision adding another layer of precision to an account that could never be made fully precise because the ones who could have corrected the record were gone. When they had developed the capacity to observe and eventually to adjust, they had done so because they believed it was the only way to prevent the thing they had watched happen from happening again. The management was not malice, it was grief, calcified over 6,000 years into doctrine. They had watched 41 species. 38 of them had survived to what the Oravathi considered stability. 3 had not. Of the 3 that had not, the Oravathi believed. Their record showed the reasoning, and Prahl parsed it carefully, that their adjustment had come too late and had been too conservative. They had been adjusting humanity for what their record showed was 83 years. I did not put that in my formal report, putting it here because it is true and because I think it matters. 83 years. Not 11, not the 44 years of active transit corridor use. 83 years, which meant they had been watching before the Kandrath corridor was opened, before the survey program that opened it was funded, before some of the decisions that led to the survey program were made. They had been watching humanity longer than humanity had been watching itself. In space, by a margin I found impossible to fully absorb, and they had been adjusting, not dramatically. Their record showed very conservative modifications, small nudges to the electromagnetic environment around human active systems, the kind of things that would influence communication patterns over years, would shape what signals a civilization chose to amplify and which ones it let fade. They were not certain what they had changed. They said that clearly, and Prahl said their uncertainty seemed genuine. They knew what they had done. They did not know what it had resulted in. That uncertainty was, I think, one of the things that frightened them. The Oravathi had a 6,000-year record of observation and adjustment, and in that record the adjustment always had a clear and measurable effect over time. The species moved in a different direction. The signals changed. The pattern of what was being broadcast evolved in the way the Oravathi had intended. 38 out of 41 times the strategy had worked, and the Oravathi had logged the result and continued their watching. For humanity, the logs showed something they had not seen before. The adjustments had been made. The signals had changed. But the changes were not clean. They were not the smooth redirections the Oravathi expected. They were more complex, more variable. The signal humanity put out in response to their adjustments was not the signal of a species being guided. It was the signal of a species arguing with itself, changing direction and then changing back, accelerating in one dimension and decelerating in another, doing things that the Oravathi's models consistently failed to predict. They had not been alarmed by this, initially. Variability was within their parameters. But over 83 years, the variability had not resolved. It had increased. By the time the Ardent crossed the Kandrath corridor on its return transit, the Oravathi assessment of humanity in their management log had a notation that Prahl translated, with a caveat about interpretive certainty as, subject exceeds current modeling capacity. We had been too unpredictable to manage cleanly, and the Oravathi had not known what to do about that, and had simply continued doing what they always did, which was to watch and adjust, and hope that over time the pattern would clarify. And then we had found their wave and sent them everything. That was the question that had no answer in the response package. And that had no answer in any of the briefings I sat through afterward. And that has no answer now, years later, sitting at a desk in a posting I will probably hold until I retire. What did 83 years of someone else's gentle, well-intentioned management do to the outward signal of a civilization? What version of humanity did the Auravathi create? And how different is it from the version we would have been without them? Nobody knows. There is no control. There is no version of humanity that was not observed, and we cannot go back. Prahl spent 2 years after the briefings trying to build a framework for isolating the adjustment signature in our historical broadcast record, looking for the moments where the Auravathi's modifications would have had measurable effects on what we chose to amplify and what we let fade. She told me, the last time we spoke properly, that she had found candidate moments. She could not confirm them. The signal was too tangled with everything else we had been doing to ourselves in the same period. The Auravathi adjustments, if they were there, indistinguishable from the noise of ordinary human history. The Auravathi withdrew the observation net. They said they would do so in the second response, and Fleet Command confirmed the withdrawal over the following 6 months, tracking the carrier wave signatures in known space as they went dark, one by one. The 3 posts in known space were confirmed closed by independent survey within a year. The posts in the transit corridor were confirmed closed within 2 years. The formal acknowledgement of Terran Federation Sovereignty over all space within our designated range was delivered through an intermediary channel. The Auravathi opened specifically for that purpose, a channel that is still, as far as I am aware, open in case we have further questions. Formal contact record classifies what happened as a successful first contact event. No shots fired, no ships lost. A mutual acknowledgement achieved, and an ancient observer civilization that had never made direct contact with any of the 41 species it had, watched for 6,000 years choosing, for the first time, to speak. The record notes that the encounter established a communication channel and both parties departed it with more information than they had arrived with. The record does not note what the Auravathi said, in their second response, about what our transmission had done to them. It had, as far as Prahl could determine, broken their classification system, not damaged it, broken it. The Auravathi had 41 data points, gathered over 6 millennia, describing how species behave under observation. The behavioral categories were refined and detailed. Passive species, aggressive species, concealing species, deflecting species, fragmenting species, species that went quiet when they suspected they were watched, species that never suspected at all. The categories were supported by decades of data for each entry. They were the organizational backbone of a 6,000-year program. We had done something none of the 41 categories anticipated. We had taken everything we were and put it on the table and said, "Here, this is what you are watching. Look at all of it." The Auravathi wrote that they did not have a category for that. The closest thing in their record was the behavior of a species under direct attack that chooses to stand its ground rather than retreat, a kind of defiant exposure. The last act of something that has decided concealment is no longer worth attempting. But that framing did not fit what we had done because we had not been under attack. We had been under quiet observation, the gentlest and threatening form of scrutiny in the Auravathi's inventory. We had not needed to stand our ground because the ground had not been threatened. We had simply chosen to be more visible than we had been. The Auravathi, in their response, described this as the behavior that had terminated their program. Not as a consequence of our forcing the issue, not as a result of some tactical decision on our part, but because what we had done revealed something about us that their management model could not account for, and therefore could not work with. You cannot shape the signal of something that has already chosen to broadcast everything. The entire architecture of their 6,000-year intervention rested on the premise that the species being managed would broadcast a curated signal, naturally present a version of themselves that omitted the uncomfortable and elevated the acceptable. Premise had held for 40 Macy over 6,000 years. We were number 42. We had not read the premise. Selene was promoted after the report was filed. She commands a heavy cruiser now, out beyond the buffer corridor. Prahl transferred to the Contact Analysis Division at Fleet Intelligence, where she has been building interpretive frameworks for the carrier wave encoding architecture because the Auravathi were willing to share their full technical specifications, and the work of understanding them is expected to take a generation. Took a posting on a station. DAS transferred to a frigate. The junior techs who helped build the transmission packages are scattered across the fleet in assignments I do not track. I stayed with the Ardent for another year and then transferred to a desk posting, which is where I am now, is where I will probably be when this document is read by someone other than me. I do not regret the desk. I have had enough of corridors that turn out not to be empty. What I think about on the days when I think about it is not the Auravathi and their 6,000 years of careful watching. It is not the 47 observation posts on their chart, or the 3 in known space, or the 83 years. Those are facts, and I have made my peace with facts. What I think about is a specific moment in the engineering core, in the earliest hours of day 57, sitting across from Prahl and her tablet, while she showed me a carrier wave with a grammar. A moment before we knew what we were looking at. Before Selene made her decision, before we built the packages, before the Auravathi opened a channel they had kept closed for 6,000 years, before any of it. A moment in which I had looked at something I did not understand and called it an equipment artifact and filed it away and gone, back to work. I think about that moment because in it I was a man who wanted not to know. Not from cowardice, or not only from cowardice, from the ordinary human preference for a settled account. The wave was and I was tired, and the path of least resistance was to label it and let it sit. The fleet has thousands of Dellen Okafors in it, filing anomalies under probably nothing, because anomalies are uncomfortable and teen is manageable. And that is not a character flaw, but a survival strategy, the same one that kept our species running for the entire span, that someone else was quietly watching over us and nudging us in directions they thought were good for us. The path that mattered was not mine. It was Prahl's. Walking through a night cycle she could not sleep through, because something in her did not accept, probably nothing, as an answer. And then it was Selene's, looking at a set of rules that did not quite fit and choosing to be true to what we were, rather than to the rules. I was there. That is all I can say for myself. I was there and I watched it happen. And I was changed by it the same way everyone's is changed by things that happen near them, in ways they cannot name or measure or separate from all the other changes that were already in progress before they knew anyone was watching. The Auravathi are still out there. The channel is still open. They have, as far as I know, continued to observe, but now they do it openly, and we do it back. And whatever will come of that arrangement over the next 100 years is someone else's problem to navigate. The 83 years before the Ardent crossed that corridor are not recoverable. The changes the Auravathi made in us across those years are not reversible, because we cannot identify them precisely enough to reverse them. They are part of what we are now, indistinguishable from everything else we have done to ourselves in the same period. That is the honest account. That is the whole unmanaged signal, for whatever it is worth to whoever reads it. We were being watched. We found out. And instead of hiding, we opened every door we had and let the light in. And something ancient and careful and very sure of itself looked at all that light, and did not have a category for it. I do not know what that made us. I only know it was the first time we had been seen clearly, by eyes that were not our own, and that we had chosen to make it easy for them to look.